What happens when the most powerful system in the Middle East starts cracking from the inside? It didn't begin with a revolution. It began with a question whispered in the streets, in homes, even inside the corridors of power. Who is really in control of Iran right now? Because something unusual is happening. Protests are no longer just protests. They've turned into a nationwide signal, a signal that something deeper is breaking. Cities are on edge, crowds are growing, and the voices are getting louder. But here's where it gets dangerous. This time, the pressure isn't just coming from the people, it's coming from within, from the very institution that was built to protect the system, the IRGC. For decades, they stood as the backbone of power, unshaken, untouchable, unquestioned. But now, even that loyalty is being tested. Reports of internal fractures, quiet disagreements, and one explosive idea spreading behind closed doors. What if the leadership itself is the problem? And if that's true, then the question is no longer about protests. It's about power, real power. Because when the streets rise and the protectors begin to hesitate, history doesn't wait. It changes, fast. Right now, Iran stands at a moment that could redefine everything: its leadership, its future, and the balance of power across the entire region. So the real question is this just another wave of unrest or the beginning of something far bigger? Stay with us, because what happens next could change everything. It didn't begin with fire. It began with whispers. In the crowded streets of Tehran, something shifted, something subtle but undeniable. Shopkeepers spoke in lowered voices. Students gathered in tighter circles. Even the walls, once filled with slogans of loyalty, began to feel uncertain. The nation had endured sanctions, war pressure, and economic collapse. But this time, the anger was different. It wasn't just about inflation or shortages, it was about power. And more dangerously, it was about doubt. For weeks, people had been asking one question: who is really in control? Reports of internal fractures had begun leaking. Some said the military was acting independently. Others claimed the political leadership had lost its grip. And then came the protests. At first, they were small, a few hundred people, then thousands, then tens of thousands. Entire districts shut down, roads blocked, chants echoing through the night. What made it different this time was not just the scale, it was the direction. The anger wasn't only aimed outward, it was aimed straight at the heart of the system. The leadership responded the only way it knew how: with force. Internet blackouts swept across the country. Security forces flooded the streets. Arrests were swift, public, and meant to intimidate. But something had changed. The fear wasn't working like before. In fact, it was fueling the movement. Videos, despite the blackout, still leaked out. Crowds confronting armored vehicles, women leading chants, workers abandoning factories, students refusing to leave campuses. This was no longer a protest. It was becoming a national rupture. Even insiders began to show cracks. Some officials quietly disappeared from public view. Others issued carefully worded statements, neither fully supporting nor condemning the unrest. Behind closed doors, arguments turned into confrontations. According to reports, the system itself was struggling to respond coherently. The question was no longer how to stop the protests. The question was, could the system survive them? Then came the moment that changed everything. A statement, brief but explosive, circulated among military circles. It wasn't from protesters, it wasn't from politicians, it was from within the security establishment itself. Members of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, long considered the backbone of the regime, were reportedly divided. Some commanders were furious, not at the protesters, but at the leadership. They believed the situation had spiraled out of control because of indecision, silence, and strategic failure. For the first time, whispers of an unthinkable demand began to spread: resignation. The idea that the supreme leader, once untouchable, could be held responsible and removed. It sounded impossible. But in a country where the streets were already defying the system, impossible was no longer off the table. Inside the halls of power, the crisis was no longer theoretical. It was immediate. Meetings stretched into the early hours of the morning. Military officials, intelligence heads, and political figures sat across from each other, not as allies, but as rivals. Each faction had its own solution. Some demanded harsher crackdowns. Others warned that more violence would only accelerate collapse. And then there was the most dangerous group of all, the pragmatists. They believed the only way to save the system was to sacrifice part of it. Their argument was simple. The protests had become a referendum on leadership. If that leadership didn't change, everything else would fall with it. Meanwhile, the Revolutionary Guard tightened its grip over key state functions, signaling a shift in real power dynamics. The balance was shifting, and everyone could feel it. On the streets, the protests evolved. This was no longer spontaneous outrage, it was organized pressure. Workers coordinated strikes across industries. Students turned campuses into resistance hubs. Even some religious figures, once pillars of the establishment, began to express concern. The chants changed. They became sharper, more direct, no longer asking for reform, but demanding accountability. And then, like a shockwave, a new development spread. Reports that factions within the IRGC were openly questioning the leadership's decisions. Publicly, they remained loyal. But privately, the fractures were undeniable. Experts had long warned that internal division was the regime's greatest vulnerability. Now, that vulnerability was fully exposed. The world was watching. Every major capital, every intelligence agency, every analyst had their eyes locked on Iran, not because of what was happening, but because of what might happen next. A regime collapse, a military takeover, a negotiated transition. The possibilities were endless and dangerous. Inside Iran, the stakes were even higher. The protests had reached a critical mass. The system was under pressure from every direction: economic, political, and now existential. Reports of crackdowns continued, including executions tied to protest activity, signaling the regime's desperation to regain control. But even that wasn't enough to restore order, because this time, the challenge wasn't just from the streets, it was from within. Behind closed doors, a decision loomed. The IRGC, arguably the most powerful institution in the country, faced a choice: stand by the leadership and risk total collapse, or intervene and reshape the system themselves. Neither option was safe. Both carried consequences that could redefine the nation's future. Some argued that demanding resignation could stabilize the situation, offer the public a concession, a sign of change. Others warned it could trigger chaos, opening the door to fragmentation or even civil conflict. But one thing was clear: doing nothing was no longer an option. The system had reached a point where every decision carried risk, and every delay made that risk worse. And then the moment arrived. Not with explosions, not with speeches, but with a shift, a signal, something behind the scenes that changed the trajectory of everything. Whether it was a message delivered, a decision agreed upon, or a line finally crossed, the outcome would shape the next chapter of Iran's history. The protests had done more than challenge the government. They had forced a question that could no longer be avoided: who truly holds power? And for the first time in decades, the answer was no longer clear. The streets waited, the military calculated, the leadership hesitated, and the future of a nation hung in the balance. It was the silence that terrified them most, not the chants, not the fires, but the sudden, unnatural stillness that fell over the streets one night. Tehran, usually restless, loud, unpredictable, went quiet. Too quiet. Security forces stood in formation, waiting for the next wave that didn't come. Protesters stayed hidden, but not defeated. This wasn't retreat. It was recalibration. Across neighborhoods, messages moved without the internet. Handwritten notes, whispered instructions, coded signals. The movement had adapted. It no longer needed mass gatherings to prove its strength. It had already done that. Now, it was preparing for something far more dangerous: coordination. Inside government buildings, officials misread the silence as progress. Some believed the crackdown had worked. Others weren't so sure, because intelligence reports told a different story, one of growing networks, decentralized leadership, and a population that had lost its fear. And when fear disappears, control begins to slip. The following morning, the illusion shattered. Protests didn't return. They multiplied. Smaller, faster, more unpredictable. One street would erupt, then vanish. Another would ignite miles away. Security forces found themselves chasing shadows. There was no single leader to arrest, no central point to suppress. It was everywhere, and nowhere at once. Meanwhile, strikes intensified. Oil workers, transportation staff, factory employees, key sectors began slowing down or stopping entirely. The economy, already fragile, started to feel the pressure. This was no longer just a political crisis. It was becoming a systemic breakdown, and within the IRGC, frustration grew. They had been trained to fight external threats, not an internal uprising that refused to behave like one. The traditional methods weren't working, and every failed attempt only made the leadership look weaker. Late that night, a classified meeting took place. Not in the usual halls of power, but in a secure, undisclosed location. Senior commanders gathered, their tone sharper than ever before. Reports were laid out: economic decline, operational failures, public sentiment. The conclusion was unavoidable. The situation was deteriorating faster than anyone had anticipated, and then one voice broke the tension: calm, direct, dangerous. "This is no longer about protests," he said. "This is about survival." No one disagreed. But survival of what? The system, the leadership, or the nation itself? That question hung in the room, unanswered but impossible to ignore. Every system has a line, a point beyond which it cannot return to what it once was. For Iran, that line was approaching fast. Inside the political establishment, divisions hardened into factions. Hardliners demanded total control, mass arrests, absolute silence, zero tolerance. Reformists, what remained of them, warned that pushing too far would ignite something irreversible. But the most critical divide wasn't political, it was institutional. The IRGC, intelligence agencies, and civilian leadership were no longer fully aligned. Orders were questioned, delayed, interpreted differently depending on who received them. In a system built on unity, this kind of fragmentation was dangerous, because once coordination breaks, authority follows. On the streets, the people sensed it. They didn't have access to classified reports or internal discussions, but they could feel the shift. The response was becoming inconsistent. In some areas, security forces were aggressive. In others, they hesitated. There were even moments, brief but powerful, where confrontation turned into standoff, and standoff turned into withdrawal. These moments spread quickly, fueling the belief that the system was no longer acting as one. And belief, in a movement like this, is everything. The protests gained a new kind of energy, not just anger, but possibility. For the first time, people began to imagine an outcome they had never considered before: real change. But inside the leadership, that possibility was seen as a threat. A critical decision loomed, one that could define everything that followed. A proposal began circulating quietly among top military figures: a controlled transition. Not collapse, not revolution, but a calculated shift designed to stabilize the system while addressing the core demand: accountability at the highest level. It was risky, unprecedented, and deeply controversial. Some saw it as the only way forward. Others saw it as betrayal, because to even consider such a move meant acknowledging that the current leadership could no longer hold the line. And once that idea takes root, it cannot be undone. The country stood on the edge of something undefined, but inevitable. Markets fluctuated wildly, businesses closed early, families stayed indoors, waiting, watching. The uncertainty was everywhere, not just in the streets, but in conversations, in decisions, in the air itself. International observers speculated endlessly, but inside Iran, speculation had turned into anticipation. Everyone knew something was coming. They just didn't know what or when. And in that space between expectation and reality, tension reached its peak. Within the IRGC, the debate reached its final stage. Arguments gave way to positions. Positions hardened into choices. The question was no longer what should be done, but who would take responsibility for doing it. Some commanders pushed for loyalty, absolute, unwavering, regardless of consequences. Others argued that true loyalty meant protecting the system from collapse, even if that required confronting its highest authority. It was a paradox with no easy answer, because either path carried risk, either path could change everything. And yet, a decision had to be made. Then came the signal, not public, not confirmed, but undeniable. Movements within key institutions shifted, communications changed, certain figures disappeared from view, while others suddenly became more visible. It wasn't chaos, it was repositioning, the kind that happens just before a major transition. The streets sensed it. The protests paused, not out of fear, but out of awareness. Something bigger than demonstrations was unfolding, something that could either validate their demands or erase them entirely. The system had reached its breaking point, not with a crash, but with a choice. And whatever came next would not just shape the future of Iran, it would redefine power itself.